Okay, so for next time, you are reading Martha Nussbaum's essay, Education for Profit, Education for Democracy. And it's probably a good idea as you read this to think back to the Seneca essay, because she's not making quite the same arguments that Seneca made, but the arguments are related, right? A lot of it is about the value of the liberal arts as opposed to the value of various kinds of technical and pre-professional education. So, does anybody have any questions about anything that's going on going forward?
What do you have to do a reflection about this time?
Okay, so your next reflection, it'll be due next week.
I thought it was.
Pardon?
Wait, what?
Yeah, the next reflection paper will be due next week. And it will be on one of the 5 education essays that we've read, right? So you can write on either, we start with Sun Tzu, Seneca, Douglass, Anzaldua, or Nussbaum.
Is this just the draft kind of like we did last time, or?
No, this isn't part of a larger paper. So this will be, you're doing the same thing you did for Exploratory Reflection 1. You're just doing it with a different set of essays.
Just to clarify, let's do like what? Like Wednesday, because Road Review said let's do this Wednesday.
What's that?
I know you said not to listen to Road Review, but I said let's do this Wednesday.
Yeah, it's going to be due next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's freaking out.
Yeah. No, if I wanted it this Wednesday, I would tell you now that I want it this Wednesday.
Can we
No,
go
it's-
ahead and get kind of a start on it? Is this the last one up here to read, or is there?
Yeah, this is the last one in this cluster, right? And then we'll do another 5 on language and rhetoric. And that'll be the 3rd cluster that you'll do the 3rd reflection on. And then we'll spend the rest of the semester just kind of working on a final research paper.
And just to be sure, that started at Sun Tzu?
Yeah, this is Sun Tzu, Seneca, Douglass, Anzaldua, and Nussbaum.
Will we be going back to writing analytically?
We will, yeah. We'll be going back to that at the end of the semester. So yeah, we will be using that again. And we are gonna do a couple more homework assignments in that, all of which are gonna be geared towards getting started on that final paper. Any other questions about where we are, what we're doing going forward? Okay, well then just to make sure that we're making connections here, let's quickly review the last 3 thinkers that we've talked about. So let's go back to Sun Tzu. What do we remember about Sun Tzu's arguments about education?
Environment, something like
Okay, the importance of environment, right?
We can't force people to be good and they need a teacher.
Okay, right. You need a teacher because you can't learn to be good on your own.
Causality? Wasn't that like, passion, there we go. There was no there wasn't any action without passion. You needed that to kind of start. I don't know where it is in here to try to explain what I'm saying. You had to have a reason to.
I think, are you talking about conscious activity? Is that the thing that you mean? Because Sun Tzu is actually passion would be the wrong word to describe Sun Tzu's position because he tends to be against emotional extremes, right?
Okay.
He views emotional behavior as selfish behavior.
In every phenomenon that appears must have a cause, the glory or shame that come to a man are no more than the image of his virtue. Like, I'm trying to.
Okay, so I think probably what you would, the way we might phrase that is like an English idiom is you reap what you sow,
Okay.
right? That if you're putting bad out into the world, you're going to get bad back, right? So if you are...
Okay, so yeah, cautious activity
Yeah,
then, okay.
exactly.
That's really
If you are acting like a shit, your reputation will reflect that, right? Okay, yeah, so you learn through conscious activity, you improve through conscious activity, right? Anything else you remember about Sun Tzu?
Respect.
Pardon?
Respect.
Okay, yeah, respect for elders and authority, right? I think we can kind of file that under the
Kind
teacher.
of, a humble nature, sort of.
Okay. Yeah.
Education is a lifelong process.
Yes, good. A lifelong process of conscious activity, right? And if you want to be a gentleman, then what do you need to learn to do with the stuff around you? What does the gentleman do when making use of his environment? Actually, I think I just kind of answered my own question. Remember the thing about thought and study, right? The thing about standing on your tiptoes versus standing on a mountain? That a big part of...
Alter your environment.
It's not about altering your environment or changing it, it's about making use of what's in it, right? Right? You make use of things that can help you. Right? You don't know something, look it up in a book, right? Because if you're just sitting there thinking about it, spinning your wheels using only what you already know, you're not going to learn that thing, right? If you want to see further, stand up on a mountain rather than up on your tiptoes, because you need something beyond your own natural capabilities to see further away, right?
I can't remember if it was him or not. I think that he did touch on it equally, but it's not enough to be taught, you have to teach as well.
I don't think that really came up in...
Okay, I
Yeah.
saw over.
Yeah.
I knew we've gone over it.
So I think you've more or less got Sun Tzu down here, right? So what about Seneca? What do you remember about Seneca?
Acceptance of things that cannot be changed.
Yes. Right? Wisdom for Seneca is learning to live in accordance with with natural cycles, right? And learning to accept things that you are unable to change, right? What else do we remember about Seneca?
He valued education over material possessions.
Okay. What we would call a liberal arts education is for him better than a purely vocational education, right? But does he actually regard a liberal arts education as good in and of itself?
No, without using it, it was worth nothing.
Yeah, you can use it as a foundation for learning wisdom, right? Though it doesn't actually teach you wisdom.
The building blocks.
Yeah.
Did he say you have to do it because you want to? It's not like running.
I'm sorry, could you just speak a little? I have like a mild ear infection, so I don't hear very well today. So,
Did he say like you have to do it because you want to? It's not like just for the money.
yeah. Well, it's not even so much just because you want to do it. It's more because it will teach you this wisdom, right? So there is an end goal in mind, but that end goal is not the pursuit of profit, right? I think we can say fairly that he completely disdains the pursuit of profit. Right, that seems to him to be kind of the worst possible end for education. Now, what about Frederick Douglass. What do we remember about Douglass from last time?
He used the emotions that he felt in his writing to kind of sway opinions for the betterment of, I guess, people in his circumstance.
Okay, I think I think what you're talking about is like this idea of sympathetic imagination, right? Yeah. And that's really kind of, that's more an element of Douglass's style than an argument about education. But what he is, what he's doing, right? We as we discussed, is letting a reader who hasn't had these kinds of experiences imagine what it's like for someone who has, right? What do we remember more strictly about his ideas regarding education, or his experiences regarding education?
It was very important to him. It paved his way to freedom.
Okay, yeah, so he is explicitly associating education with liberation, right? Right, literacy in particular provides him with a means of intellectual and then actual physical liberation, right? And at first, he expands his mind by learning to read, and then he's able to forge a path to get himself to freedom once he's learned to write, right? Now, what does he demonstrate about, what points does his story demonstrate about getting an education that relate back to some of these other two?
A lifelong process.
Okay, yeah, it's a long process for him,
And then you
right?
need a teacher.
Yeah. He lacks a teacher, right? He doesn't have a formal teacher. And while he's able to get along without a teacher, he's able to finish this process without a teacher, because he doesn't have one, it takes a lot longer, right? What else? Are there other principles of Sun Tzu's in particular that he kind of exemplifies?
Environment.
Yeah, making use of what's available to you, right? He doesn't have a teacher, but he proves to be an expert at using what resources are in his possession, right? From what free time is given to him to, his access to the shipyards, right? Pardon?
Like time management? Did you say time management?
Yeah, that was kind of part of it, right? Yeah, it was that he's given those couple hours a week when his mistress is at church, when he is then free to pretty much do whatever the hell he wants because no one's watching.
One of the things we didn't cover last time that I noticed, he was very cunning in the ways he went about, I guess, not so much tricking the kids, but sort of kind of.
Yeah.
I don't know if that would fall under the use what it was, or if it would
Mhm.
fall under something different.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one thing that it is that does demonstrate his resourcefulness, and
That would be like standing on the tiptoes versus, flat-footed, seeing things in a different way.
yeah, well, I think the thing that remember what the actual analogy there is standing on your tiptoes to see further versus climbing a mountain to see further, right?
Okay.
So, right, using only your own physical capabilities when you're standing on your tiptoes, right? Nothing outside the self. But climbing the mountain, you're actually using nature's resources, right, to help you. And I think that, it's more like the standing on a mountain here, right? It's like, okay, there are these aids available to me, but you're right, he can't directly approach them and say, will you teach me how to write? He has to use guile and trickery in order to get the knowledge that he wants. So yeah, I think that one of the things we might want to note here, is that one of the things that's demonstrated here is that education is possible without a formal process. Now, let's try and see where Gloria Anzaldua fits into all this. What did you guys think of this? How did this go for you?
It was okay. I liked it, but I wish that, the language barrier, so it was kind of hard to like stay focused.
Yeah.
But I did like it.
Okay, yes, if you're not bilingual, right, you have to pause and translate the Spanish and then go back to reading, right? So so that kind of disrupts the rhythm of the piece. Sometimes it takes you out of it, right? But why do you think it's so important to her to leave the bilingual parts, that it be bilingual and the Spanish parts not be translated? Yeah, go ahead.
Kind of the same thing I got from it. It was a bit passionate, keeping a passion for, I guess, oneself, one's identity, sort of.
Okay, This one is much more focused on construction of identity than most of the others, right?
I think she kind of left it in there to be almost like defiant, because the whole piece talked about them like putting a lid on her being Hispanic and speaking Spanish. They're like, okay, we don't want you to speak Spanish, we want you to speak English. And then so she's like, okay, this is me not holding my tongue, this is me like speaking out against what I was taught.
Yeah, I think that's actually pretty much exactly what she's going for there, right? I mean, this is like, her language, her natural language does flow back and forth between English and Spanish, right?
I think so, like not being ashamed of like who she is and like where she comes from.
Yeah. And one of the things that she's trying to stress, like one of the things that Anzaldua is famous for, one of her key theoretical concepts is the idea of the borderland. And in part, this is an autobiographical concern, because she grew up on the border between Texas and Mexico, right? On the Texas side of the line. So what kinds of ideas do we usually associate with borders?
Walls.
Okay.
That's been kind of pushed here lately.
But one of the interesting things about even, the border wall that they've been talking about constructing now for years, right? Why hasn't it been built?
I don't know how to phrase it. Kind of along the same lines of how the Berlin Wall came down. There were too many people who opposed the idea of not integrating with each side.
Sure, and I mean, like, it also didn't help that the East side was a client state of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union collapsed, so there was nothing propping them up anymore. So part of that was economic, right? But the issue with the border wall specifically here, right, is that land ownership issues on the border are actually extremely complicated. Much of the proposed border wall would have to go through private lands. And a lot of those private lands cover areas that are on both sides of the border. Right, so somebody might own a ranch along the border. It might be, the main body of the ranch might be in Texas or might be in Mexico. But one person owns all that land and doesn't really distinguish much between whether the cows are grazing in Texas or grazing in Mexico, right? There are also a lot of cities along the border that are basically contiguous with another city on the other side, right? So I know that there are examples in Texas and in Arizona. The example that I'm more familiar with is actually on the Canadian border. Detroit, Michigan, is right across the bridge from Windsor, Ontario. And even though they are different cities and different countries with separate political structures, there's so much back and forth between the two cities, right? There are people in Detroit who work in Windsor, people in Windsor who work in Detroit. People go back and forth across that bridge to shop or go to restaurants or whatever, right? So the distinction between these two places is not nearly as clean as the imposition of a border makes it seem, right?
I try to think of it as like the in-between. If that's like a word for it.
Yeah, a border is what literary scholars call a liminal place, right? Have any of you ever heard this term before, liminal? Does anyone know what a liminal space is? Okay, so liminal comes from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. So like the threshold of the door. And a liminal space is in a lot of ways exactly what Hannah just described. It's a kind of in-between space, right? It's not quite one thing and it's not quite another, but it's also both, while being its own individual thing, right? Does that make sense? So think of things like a coastline, right? It's not quite ocean, it's not quite land. At the same time, it's both, right? It's where the two meet. Something like a clearing in a forest, right? It's not quite meadow, it's not quite forest, but it is where the two meet, right? And yeah, borders are this kind of place, and I think that's kind of how Anzaldua uses them, right? That the border identity is itself a kind of independent identity, right? That also fuses elements of other identities, right? It's constructed out of a variety of different elements, linguistic and cultural. But it is also kind of its own thing. Now, did you notice also that there's a particular word that she uses to refer to herself? How does she refer to her cultural identity? What word does she use?
The M word.
Which word?
Miss.
Okay, yeah, she does sometimes say mestizo or mestiza, right? Does anybody know what this means?
Is it like a mix between?
It's like mixture.
Yeah, mestizo is a hybrid cultural identity.
I guess it depends
Specific, to Mexico and Latin America.
like male or female, depending on how you use it.
Yeah, exactly. So mestizo is masculine, mestiza is feminine. But yeah, so mestizo refers to essentially a hybrid identity between people of Spanish descent and people of indigenous descent. So if you had, say, like Spanish and Aztec or Spanish and Mayan ancestors, right, then you would be mestizo. What were you going to say, Danielle?
I had seen where it said Chicana.
Yeah, Chicana is actually more the term that she tends to use for her cultural identity, right? Mestizo is a little bit more general term. Yeah, Chicana is the word she uses more often to refer to herself and her own culture. Does anybody know what Chicana means? This isn't a word that, this is a word that would probably be more familiar to you if this was the 60s or the 70s. It's not a word that gets used as much to describe a particular cultural group anymore. But Chicana, or Chicano, the masculine, specifically refers to Mexican-American cultures. Pardon?
Oh, isn't that the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans and stuff? Or is that from later?
No, you might be thinking that the Cubano is often used to describe Cubans.
Instead of nuestros. They use nuestros instead of nuestros, and that's the first time she heard it.
Yeah. So one of the things that she wants to do is distinguish this specifically Mexican-American border identity, right, from those other Latin American identities, right? So she doesn't use the term Hispanic. She doesn't use the term Latino to describe herself. Her definition is more specific, right? Chicana, Mexican-American, often of mestizo background. Right, associated with a hybrid language that mixes elements of Mexican Spanish with elements of English, with American English. And Chicano was adopted as a label by a lot of people in the 60s as part of a kind of linguistic and cultural pride movement, right, that was specifically focused on a Mexican-American identity and not on a broader Latino identity. So what she is trying to, so what she is defining herself as is both hybrid and specific, right? One of the things that she wants to point out in the essay, in fact, is how different she and her relatives are from Puerto Ricans and from Cubans and from people in South America, right? That this is a separate thing. Okay, any questions so far? So let's talk then about how all of this kind of relates to ideas of education. I think the little anecdote about the dentist at the beginning is a good place to start. Can I get somebody to read this for us, starting with, we're going to have to control your tongue. Very studiously looking down. Any one of you, any one of you can just start reading.
We're going to have to control the
Thank you.
tongue. The dentist says, pulling out all the metal from my mouth. Silver bits plop and tinkle into the basin. My mouth is a mother lode. The dentist is cleaning out my roots. I get a whiff of the stench when I gasp. I can't cap that tooth yet. You're still draining, he says. We're going to have to do something about your tongue. I hear the anger rising in his voice. My tongue keeps pushing out the wads of cotton, pushing back the drills, the long, thin needles. I've never seen anything as strong or as stubborn, he says. And I think, how do you tame a wild tongue? Train it to be quiet. How do you bridle and saddle it? How do you make it lie down?
Okay, so let's think about the relationship here between the tongue and the dentist, right? What is the dentist trying to do to the tongue?
Control it?
Yeah, he wants it to stop moving, right? Because it's making it hard for him to extract the fillings from her teeth so he can clean out the roots, right? So even, there's a metaphor in that as well. But let's focus for a moment on the dentist and the tongue. So what is the tongue meant to be an image for here?
Her identity or her capabilities?
Think more specifically, right? What do we often use the word tongue to mean if we're not talking about a literal tongue?
Words?
Yeah, we use it to refer to language, right? Right? If I say, for example, I'm speaking my native tongue, right? I mean that I'm speaking my native language, right? You know, if someone is speaking in tongues, it means they're speaking in a variety of different languages they're not supposed to know, right? So yeah, the word tongue is often used to refer to language, right? As a sort of is it synecdoche or it doesn't matter if it's synecdoche or never mind. But yeah, it's used as a stand-in for language, right? Now what about the dentist? So what that the dentist is bent on getting her tongue under control. What, broadly speaking, then, does the dentist represent?
Government oppression?
Yeah, at the very, yeah, some form of authority, right? And we'll talk about a couple of different levels of authority as we go through this, right? But yeah, here's this authority figure who wants to stop her tongue from moving so he can get things out of her mouth. What does that suggest her value to this authority, whatever it is? And again, think about what he's pulling out of her mouth. We're going to have to control your tongue, the dentist says, pulling out all the metal from my mouth. Silver bits plop and tinkle into the basin. My mouth is a mother lode. What does she make it sound like the dentist is doing or trying to do?
Remove her ability to speak? Is this metaphorical or literal?
It is metaphorical, right? So, in what context do we see the word mother lode? Where do we tend to see people trying to pull out bits of silver?
Mining?
Yeah. So the dentist is mining for silver in her mouth, right? So it might become a little bit more clear what's going on here, what this means, if we then look at the two passages that follow, right? Can I get somebody to read the paragraph? Serenity, could you read the paragraph that starts with, I remember being caught speaking Spanish at recess?
I remember being caught speaking Spanish at recess. That was good for 3 licks on the knuckles with the sharp ruler. I remember being sent to the corner of the classroom for talking back to the Anglo teacher when all I was trying to do was tell her how to pronounce her name. If you want to be American, speak American. If you don't like it, go back to Mexico where you belong.
Okay, so a couple of things to pull out of this here. First off, what does she mean by Anglo?
White?
Yeah, white. And does the term Anglo necessarily refer to skin color? What's Anglo more likely to refer to?
American.
Pardon?
American.
Well, also think about the context in which she gets in trouble here. What does she get in trouble for doing?
I think it's like me and other.
English.
Yeah, English, right? So this is really more of a linguistic identity than a racial identity, right? So yeah, and when she talks about an Anglo, she means a white person generally, but what she's really in a lot of ways more concerned with is that it's a white English-speaking person, right? But does this white English-speaking person actually claim to speak English? This teacher, she says speak American, right? If you want to be American, speak American. Why do you think Anzaldua has this teacher say speak American rather than speak English?
Maybe like the accent or the way she pronounced it.
Yeah, I mean, American English is distinct from British English, right? It is itself a distinct departure from development of British English, right? And there's also a kind of irony here. There's a kind of irony here as well, right? In large part because Anzaldua sees her identity as American as well, right? That her American identity is actually bound up in several different languages we'll talk about in a moment, rather than the official English that she's being taught at school. And how is the situation at recess here similar to what's happening with the dentist and her tongue? What is she getting in trouble for here?
Her tongue, like resisting.
Yeah, she's getting in trouble because, she's speaking Spanish, right, when she's not supposed to. So her tongue is resisting authority here. And then she gets in further trouble for talking back to the teacher, for trying to tell her to pronounce her name, right? So I don't think this word was current when Anzaldua wrote this, but I mean, how many of you have heard the term microaggression before?
Oh, we heard about this when Ben Carr was here.
Okay.
It's something that you don't know that you're doing. Like you feel like you can do it because you can get away with it. Like, can I use you an example? Would you do that? I'm trying to think how she worded it. Like, Serena can act that way because she's black. Like, and you think like there's nothing wrong with that, and then just because you can like say it.
Yeah, or like going up to someone and asking if you can touch their hair or something like that, right? Or or repeatedly mispronouncing someone's name when you know better, right? These kinds of small, relatively subtle things that make a person feel different and less than, right? And that's the kind of thing that she's referring to in this classroom interaction, right? Where all she's trying to do is tell the teacher how to properly pronounce her name. And the teacher basically says, right, shut the fuck up, I'll tell you what your name is, right? Pardon?
It reminds me of Roots.
Yeah. I mean, that was, I think the example you're thinking of where he's renamed and refuses to submit is more aggression than microaggression. Yeah, but this is,
That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah.
Still
Oh, yeah. But and it's a similar situation that it involves a kind of renaming, right? It's like, no, I don't care what you want to be called. I'll call you what I think your name should be, right? Now then, Hannah, can you read the next paragraph too? Like, if you want to skip the Spanish, I can offer a translation of that.
I'm pretty. Are we going to like our accents or?
Yeah, exactly.
Alright. I want you to speak English. Speak English. Para hablar bien trabajo tienes que saber hablar el inglés bien. Que va toda tu educación si tu vida hablas inglés con un accent. My mother would say, mortified that I spoke English like a Mexican. At Pan American University, all Chicano students were required to take 2 speech classes. Their purpose to get rid of our accents.
Okay, so the Spanish translates to the thing that her mother tells her, right? To find a good job, you have to understand English well. What good is your education if you speak English with an accent? So what does she not want for her daughter? What does she not want her daughter to do?
She doesn't want her to speak in the Spanish accent.
Why does she want her to get rid of her accent, I guess?
Because it'll make her stand out. Like, because people don't like people who stand out.
Yeah, what she's trying to do is get her to be less different, right? Be less other. What she's encouraging is assimilation, right? And this is exactly what the educational authorities at Pan American University, where she's working on her bachelor's degree, do as well, right? Chicano students specifically are told to take are made to take 2 semesters of speech classes to try to smooth out their accents, right? And this is something that often happens through the process of education, right? University education in particular. We try to teach a particular version of English that kind of homogenizes the way people speak, right? So to give you an example, if I were to speak in like my native accent, Northeast Pennsylvania English, right, it would sound a lot more like this. It's a little bit of a mix of the Irish and the Polish, because that's who came over to work in the mines in the 1800s, right? You know, you tend to like say pronounce THs as Ds and things like that. It sounds a little bit like that upper Midwestern Norwegian accent, but not quite. It's a little different because, like, again, like we're not Norwegian. We're Irish or Polish.
Can you say that one?
Pardon?
Like say something in a Pennsylvanian accent.
I thought he just did.
That doesn't sound like
That was
it. Does not sound like it. Like to me, it doesn't like sound different. I don't know why.
To you, it doesn't sound. Maybe it's Damask, huh?
It's giving
There it is.
Irish.
Yeah, it's well.
But like it doesn't really sound that different. I don't know.
Yeah, not really.
But yeah, well, you know, but okay, and maybe it's, you know, that all Northeasterners sound alike.
I don't know,
But yeah, my point is really that like, in having rounded out a lot of the local idiosyncrasies of my speech, right? Then I speak a kind of English that is much more connected to social class and level of education than to place, right? So arguably, a particular facet of my identity gets kind of rounded out or erased through education, right?
It did not sound that different. I don't know. Maybe I'm just weird.
Yeah, I don't
Kind
know.
of like Ebonics.
Yeah, it's a similar. It's a similar kind of thing. Yeah, where you know, it is what we call Black vernacular English has its own grammar and its own vocabulary, and so it has all the elements of a language, and indeed, like, it's mutually intelligible. Like, it is English. Like, you know, speakers of English and speakers of other dialects of English and speakers of Black vernacular English can understand each other, right? But because it's not the kind of prestige it's not the prestige dialect, right? It's not the prestige dialects that people like this Anglo teacher and Anzaldua's mother want her speaking, right? It's people want their children to unlearn it, right? People want their children to unlearn it, and people in the educational system want speakers of it to unlearn it, right? Without regarding it as a viable form of communication with its own cultural and artistic traditions, right? I'm not sure Northeast Pennsylvania English has a strong cultural or artistic tradition, but you get what I mean, right? So, what is the lesson that she keeps getting about language from the educational system?
There's some that are considered less than.
Yeah, that's part of it, right? And she's part of that less than, right? Her linguistic identity is seen as other, is seen as different.
One that needs to be eradicated.
Yeah, that difference then has to be erased. And she has to then be brought into the broader American body public, right? So in order for you to get ahead you have to assimilate, right? So this linguistic choice here, this linguistic process, this process of education is associated with assimilating into the dominant culture, right? Only if you play by the dominant culture's rules are you going to get ahead. Now this is quite different from Douglass, right? Douglass actually did actively buck the rules of the establishment, which argued that he couldn't get an education. But for him, education represented liberation, right? Does formal education seem to represent liberation for Anzaldua? Yeah, pretty much all of her interactions with institutions of formal education are negative, right? There's this with the teacher here. And then a little later on, if we look on page 41, she's talking about her experiences as a school teacher and then as a PhD student. Right? In the 1960s, I read my first Chicano novel. It was City of Night by John Rechy, a gay Texan, son of a Scottish father and a Mexican mother. For days I wandered around in stunned amazement that a Chicano could write and get published. When I read I Am Joaquin, I was surprised to see a bilingual book by a Chicano in print. When I saw poetry written in Tex-Mex for the first time, a feeling of pure joy flashed through me. I felt like we really existed as a people. So when she sees these Chicano and Tex-Mex novels and poems in print, how does this make her feel?
Elated.
Pardon?
Elated.
Elated, right? And why?
Representation.
Yeah, representation. It's essentially, okay, like, so actual publishing houses have picked up and put out these books, right? So this is cultural recognition here, right? This is recognition that someone else thinks my culture has value, right? This is like, that we've been verified now, right? And then if we compare this to what happens when she tries to teach these books in schools, right? In 1971, when I started teaching high school English to Chicano students, I tried to supplement the required text with works by Chicanos, only to be reprimanded and forbidden to do so by the principal. He claimed that I was supposed to teach American and English literature. At the risk of being fired, I swore my students to secrecy and slipped in Chicano's short stories, poems, a play. So she thinks that, okay, Chicano culture is getting some level of institutional recognition. We're being published now. And then what happens when she tries to teach these texts to her students?
She's met with the same mindset.
Yeah, the principal steps in and says no, right? And what is he telling her she's supposed to be doing?
English, not mixed English.
Well, think about
American.
the specific word choices here, right? American and English.
It's kind of like they're suppressing their culture and who they are. With like saying English and American is proper and like their culture is not.
Well, and I think why does she put American in quotes?
Because American's more than just English.
Chicano basically is American also.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when she points out this novel by John Rechy, right? City of Night. Where is John Rechy from?
American.
Yeah, he's from Texas, right? He is an American writer. I Am Joaquin is written by an American writer, right? So what she's pointing out here is the narrow fixation on a particular definition of American, right? That does not include identities like hers. And this, this has been a long time fight, a long time battle in public school systems. I remember recently in Arizona a few years ago, the state school board and the state legislature banned what they called ethnic studies classes. So basically any class that focused on a particular cultural identity was erased from the curriculum. So, there were no, no Latino studies classes, no Black studies classes, nothing like that in the high school curricula in the state of Arizona. And a lot of people who taught those subjects and students who wanted those subjects in the curriculum protested this. I'm not sure exactly where that stands now, but, this is something that's still a live issue, right? What is the definition of American culture, American literature? And Anzaldua is arguing that Chicano language and Chicano culture are part of that definition, right? That this is American. When she talks about music, a little further down here, right? The whole time I was growing up, there was norteño music, sometimes called North Mexican border music, or Tex-Mex music, or Chicano music, or cantina bar music. I grew up listening to conjuntos, 3 or 4 piece bands made up of folk musicians playing guitar, bajo sexto, drums, and button accordion, which Chicanos had borrowed from the German immigrants who had come to Central Texas and Mexico to farm and build breweries. In the Rio Grande Valley, Steve Jordan and Little Joe Hernandez were popular, and Flaco Jimenez was the accordion king. The rhythms of Tex-Mex music are those of the polka, also adapted from the Germans, who in turn had borrowed the polka from the Czechs and the Bohemians. So what is she pointing out here about Mexican music?
There's like a little mix of everything.
Yeah, that it's a hybrid form, right? It's a hybrid of Spanish folk music and different kinds of Central European folk music, because there were Germans who came to Mexico to settle. So that it is, by its very nature, a hybrid form, right? When she talks about film, when she talks about these corridos, these songs that she grew up listening to. I remember the hot, sultry evenings when corridos, songs of love and death on the Texas-Mexican borderlands, reverberated out of cheap amplifiers from the local cantinas and wafted in through my bedroom window. Corridos first became widely used along the South Texas-Mexican border during the early conflict between Chicanos and Anglos. The corridos are usually about Mexican heroes who do valiant deeds against the Anglo oppressors. Pancho Villa's song La Cucaracha is the most famous one. Corridos of John F. Kennedy and his death are still very popular in the valley. So that's interesting, right? That this folk form that evolves around stories of conflict between Anglos and Mexicans, between Anglos and Chicanos, that one of the themes that becomes popular is the death of John F. Kennedy, right? Again, what is she illustrating?
Cultural blending.
Yeah. That this is American music, right? That deals with American themes. A little bit further on, she talks about how her generation, particularly those who were slightly educated, preferred country and western and rock and roll.
So she says older Chicanos, is she talking about like men and women or just like the older men?
Pardon?
Like when she says older Chicanos, is she talking about like men and women or just like older men?
She's defaulting to the masculine to talk about everyone. That used to be the grammatical rule. It's not anymore. So country and western and rock and roll. Now, what do we know, if anything, about the origins of these two musical forms? Does anybody know where country and western music comes from? Okay, so it's actually adapted from the folk music of the British Isles. In particular, the folk music of Scotland and Ireland. And then, sort of like applied to a new context in North America. Now, what about rock and roll? Where does rock music originate? Where does it come from? Yeah.
It's in England.
Actually, it's American. It does originate in the United States. And it originates in the attempts of white musicians who only knew country and western chords and scales to try to play R&B and the blues. So it's the result of white musicians trying to figure out how to play black music. But her point here is that even the assimilationist Chicanos that she knows, the musical forms that they prefer are themselves hybrid forms, right? That come from cultural blending. So I think that one of the bigger arguments that she's trying to make here is that in a lot of ways America is this kind of is a kind of borderland in which a variety of different identities meet and clash and sometimes mix, and that trying to define Americanness according to a narrow linguistic and cultural standard and using the educational system to enforce that particular definition basically erases much of what actually makes America interesting and erases whole identities from what it means to be American. Now, there's one last thing that I want to look at here. I do find it kind of interesting to like above here on page 42. They talk about going to the drive-in movies. They're going to see Mexican movies, and they're eating cheese and bologna white bread sandwiches. Right? Is there anything more like white Anglo-American than cheese and bologna white bread sandwich? I want to look at this list of languages. She says that she and most Texan Chicanos speak. Page 38, right? Chicano Spanish sprang out of the Chicanos' need to identify ourselves as a distinct people. We needed a language with which we could communicate with ourselves, a secret language. For some of us, language is a homeland closer than the Southwest. For many Chicanos today live in the Midwest and the East. And because we are a complex, heterogeneous people, we speak many languages. Some of the languages we speak are Standard English, Working Class and Slang English, Standard Spanish, Standard Mexican Spanish, North Mexican Spanish dialect, Chicano Spanish. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California have regional variations. Tex-Mex, and Pachuco called Calo. So, would we recognize all of the languages she speaks on this list as different? Let me put it this way, would official educational organizations and systems recognize these 8 languages as different languages? Would it recognize some of them as languages at all? Yeah, Tex-Mex and this Pachuco, this youth language that she talks about, right, would certainly probably not be recognized, right? And remember, like what does the school system try to do typically to dialect and to working class language? Yeah, get rid of it, right? So underneath Standard English, right, this is the one she puts at the top. There are all of these other linguistic identities. Now, why do you think she puts Standard English at the top? Why is that number 1? Is it because it's the linguistic identity she's most closely attached to?
Possibly the one she uses most often?
It might be the one she uses the most often, yeah.
Or it could be what she identifies as
Yeah. I think what she's ranking them in terms of is probably cultural prestige, right? And notice that she puts even standard Spanish below working class English, right? That the first two things on the list here are English, right? If for her mother who wanted to assimilate, right, and to speak English without an accent, right, would speaking English with an accent probably be better than not speaking English? Even if she is speaking some variation of standard English, would probably be regarded as better socially and culturally, right, than speaking no English at all. Because then standard Spanish comes next on the list, right? And so, we're running about out of time here, but I wanted to note how she is using a method that is in a lot of ways similar to Douglass's, right? Her method is autobiographical, although she's not focusing on a single period in her life like Douglass is, right? But she is much less sanguine, I think, much less hopeful than Douglass is about the liberatory potential of education, right? In part because most of her experiences in formal education have been attempts to stomp on or erase her identity, right? She talks about her PhD supervisor as well, refusing to work on Chicano literature with her.
Also, the language didn't keep her from getting the education.
No, it doesn't, right? She still earns a bachelor's degree, earns a PhD, and actually does, as she states, do the PhD in the thing she wanted to do it in. It takes some convincing, but she does manage to get an advisor who'll work with her on it, right? And she does also manage to get those Chicano novels to her students, right? Even if she has to break the rules to do it. So I think, as I'm kind of like rethinking this and the wheels are spinning here, there is a connection to Douglass here also, in that her real education comes by breaking the rules, right? And kind of persistently bucking the system. Now, when we look at Martha Nussbaum next time, Nussbaum is going to be talking about how educational systems are set up. And she's going to be talking about, in particular, how they're set up to attain certain goals, right? Whether they're set up to attain the goal of producing an informed citizenry that is ready for democracy, to participate in democracy, or whether they are focused primarily on economic growth and thus kind of setting up an educational system that is designed solely to churn out profitable and productive workers. So that's the big divide we're going to be looking at with Nussbaum. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
So I guess what she's saying, milestones can't be taken, they can only be cut out. That's they're supposed to start kind of conforming them to the American customs or society.
I think that. I think that relates to this whole notion of assimilation, right? That someone who is fully assimilated is like a tongue that's been it's like their tongue has been cut out. They're no longer speaking their own language or following their own identity. That's really all I have to say about that. Does anybody have any other questions?
Not only does she mention a barrier between Anglo people, but also within her own community.
That she notes linguistic and cultural differences between Chicanos in different places, that Chicanos are different from Hispanics and Latinos, right? These are different identities. So yeah, I think that is actually one thing that is interesting, is the way she divides up these, separate identities that outsiders tend to view as monolithic, right? And yeah, I think that would actually probably be, we don't really have time to do that right now, but that would also be a kind of interesting thing to pick apart, right? Is like how specific she gets in determining identities. I think, yeah, that's a really good catch. All right, guys. So are we ready to get cleaned up and get out of here? All right.